welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. Now, the gathering of intelligence and sensitive information through espionage is an age-old practice. From the king's moles in the kingdom to agents sent to enemy lands to sophisticated CCTV system surveillance is widespread. But the question is, why do governments need to rely so heavily on spies and surveillance? On today's show, we discuss how espionage is transforming and whether the need for it is increasing. We also explore whether if security is the only reason why countries are continuously investing more and more in intelligence services, or could there be more to it? We welcome our guest to the show today, Mr. Mathew Bunker, a security expert and a specialist in counter-corporate espionage and the managing director of the security firm ARX Risk. He's joining us from Brisbane, Australia. We're also joined by Mr. Valerio Bordonaro, who's the advisor to former Italian Prime Minister Enrico Letta. He's joining us from Italy. And in the studios, we're joined by Brigadier Imran Malik, retired, who's an analyst, a former defense advisor to Australia and New Zealand, and Secretary General of Pakistan Forum for Security and Development. Thank you all for joining us. Now, Mr. Bunker, let me begin with you. How can we understand what espionage is for all the diverse activities that are involved in it, the various ways to go about it? Give us a brief overview of what it constitutes.
Yeah, so really spying by nation states, you can look at that in terms of trying to enhance economic advantage over other states, steal valuable intellectual property that can be exploited for their own purposes, and obtain information that divulges political or military plans, including the production of things like sensitive materials, weapons, or new encryption techniques. It's also a means for nation states to obtain political advantage and discredit other nations or discredit other political parties that they don't want to have influence within certain regions. One of the biggest things or areas where spying is really taking place is in our education systems, because within our education systems, that's where a lot of intellectual property is born. So there's a lot of spying on education institutes to obtain that intellectual property, and also to obtain information on dual citizens that they can then groom for their own intelligence purposes. And I suppose lastly, the other point with motivations of spying is for corporations. Corporations really do it for two reasons. And the first reason is to obtain competitive advantage. And the second reason is to undermine the competition through either disinformation or sabotage.
Right. And you're an expert on corporate espionage. Just tell us how widespread and prevalent is it? Do all companies and corporations, are they all involved in it? Or is it a select few, those who have monopoly doing it on smaller competitors? Give us a sense of that.
Look, I don't think I will be able to, anyone would be able to say that everyone's doing it. I think that's probably too big a blanket to cast over the corporate world. However, it is very prevalent that this is occurring, and why? Because there's often within industries a race to the top, and to get there, a lot of companies will use spying, and they can either do that through cyber-related means, or they can plant insiders within another organisation to steal information that way. So, yes, it is prevalent, and it is going on and often occurring.
Right. And we'll talk a little more about what happens when that information is extracted. But before that, I'd like to talk to Mr. Bordonaro about the fact that how do you think espionage has evolved? Let's talk about the Cold War, how it was then, and then post 9/11, and how it is in the digitalized age. How do you think it's changing and transforming?
I would say that, gathering intelligence is the second oldest job in the human history. Any country is trying to do so since ages. I think the Romans and the ancient Greek were doing that. So it's quite normal that these kind of things are happening. What is changing today is the speed rate at which they are changing and changing tools. It's dramatic how it is changing. It's so fast that we cannot really understand to which extent the data that are collected are used for good purposes, for example, security, or evil ones. And this is a little bit difficult to understand at this point. And I don't know if we're going to be able to do so with this speed that is changing so much.
Right. Brigadier Malik, listening to what both of our previous guests talked about, the reasons, motivations. Now, you and your experience, what does it tell you about this intelligence gathering? And is it as simple as just extracting information? How can a layman understand this?
See, first of all, if I may say a few words regarding the evolution of espionage over the years and now to the stage that it has come now. I mean, previously one used to talk of spies and espionage, but now it has become a much more complex thing. And now it has actually become a part of the fifth generation warfare. And states use espionage in cohorts with terrorism, in cohorts with so many other elements of fifth generation warfare, like the media, like propaganda, like misinformation, disinformation, and psychological warfare, etc. And this is how now this entire espionage industry, I would say, has evolved. The biggest example is, I think, Pakistan itself. I mean, if we see a study of what's happening in Pakistan over the last few years now, I would say, we can see espionage and terrorism combining together to form a very lethal partnership against Pakistan. And once we see India, for example, employing its fifth generation warfare principles against Pakistan, in addition to espionage plus terrorism, then we get the whole modern version of how one state acts against another state.
Right.
Now, no, it becomes incumbent upon every state to find out what its enemy is planning to do against it. So there are two basic elements which one state must find out about the other. One is the enemy's intent, and the other is his capability. The intent is not permanent, it is a variable, it can change. From one day you are friends, the other day you can be an enemy. But the capabilities are a little more permanent. And the harm that the enemy can do against you then defines or dictates to you what your strategies, your operational strategies, or your tactical plans would be.
Right.
Similarly, now, to know the intent of the enemy, to know his capabilities, you employ all covert and overt means to find out information of the enemy. Now, if the enemy has acquired a certain, for example, weapon system, let's talk of the S-400 anti-ballistic missile systems that the Indians, for example, are acquiring from Russia. So that piece of information that the Indians are acquiring S-400 ABM system would be just information. But once we get information from from a lot of other sources, then we collate all of them, collect them together, and we form a picture. That collated picture then gives us the intelligence. Then it tells us what that piece of information means.
Right.
So if the S-400 is coming to India as a piece of information, the intelligence would be where, how, and when will it be used, and what do we need to do against it?
Right. So, Brigadier Malik, from what I understand from everything that you're saying is that there's often a very specific reason why governments would go out and carry out espionage, try to find something in order to know more about the enemy or to protect themselves, to preempt something.
It is always there. You see, it's a well-known maxim in the military in particular and elsewhere as well, that well planned is half the battle won.
Right.
And you can only plan well if you know the requisite and the specific information that you have.
Right. So hold on to that thought. I want to jump back to Mr. Bunker and ask him, now, post the Edward Snowden scandal, what was revealed to the world showed that there was an immense amount of data being collected on almost all, not all citizens, but many, many citizens, not just US citizens, but foreign citizens as well. And many people questioned whether all of this was for security reasons. And whatever is happening now, more and more people are coming to the realization that it's beyond that. Let's talk about that a little more. This surveillance, what are some of the things that it's being used for?
The collection of personal information by nation states is used for a number of reasons. Let's take, for example, nation states will use the opportunity to obtain key pieces of information about personal political views of marginal voting areas And what this does, it allows them to target those individuals with disinformation about opposing political parties or discredit other nations' political parties so the candidate of their choosing can win. If you look at cyber criminals and also nation states, they use social media, they use the internet, they use big data to collect sensitive information, personal information on people so that they can then tailor and socially engineer cyber attacks. And there's, I think the important thing here is that, as individuals, everyone needs to be cautious that your interaction online records everything. And companies also need to understand exactly how third parties are treating their information as well.
And I'm glad you brought that point up, Mr. Bunker, because one pressing question is that, and something that was revealed during the Cambridge Analytica scandal as well, was that many people gave permission to certain apps, and these permissions are buried in the terms and conditions, and people often don't know that they're giving consent to be under surveillance. Now, how can consumers protect themselves from this?
Look, so I think there's been some changes to data breach and privacy laws in a lot of countries. Let's take, for example, European Union brought in the GDPR, and that's enabled a much tighter regulation and laws which organisations need to abide by in order to protect either personally identifiable information or sensitive information of individuals. So there's these types of regulations that organisations and governing bodies are bringing in, which are enhancing that. But what's important to understand as an individual is that there's a lot of organisations out there, and there's a lot of, I suppose, criminals out there that aren't bound by these laws, and they're not bound by this legislation. And it is very, very easy to obtain personal information and sensitive information of people by conducting what we call open source intelligence gathering operations. And essentially, you can build an entire intelligence picture on an individual and an organisation just by the information that they're putting online into different sites and into different applications. So it's about gathering the big data and then turning it into intelligence. And this is what nation states do. This is what criminals do. And any information that's put online, you need to understand that it will be freely available to criminals, to nation states, and those willing to exploit it.
Right. And that is a chilling picture you present there, Mr. Bunker. On that note, Mr. Bordonaro, and we're talking about the accumulation of this data. And of course, that is becoming a greater interest for not just companies, but countries at large when we move and talk about how big data is playing a role in this fifth generational warfare. Could you take us through that?
Well, I'm glad Mr. Bunker quoted GDPR. I think it's something like a world golden standard for this matter. But the laws and the states are still behind technology. It means that we are not yet ready to cope with them. And it's not clear when states and companies are two separate entities. I want to quote a fact that happened yesterday in Italy. It was a booming day for a face app. This app makes you look 10 or 20 years older, and it works like taking measurements of your face. But at the same time, we are talking a lot about facial recognition for payments. So imagine, yesterday, a private company gathered millions of facial data about people. And today we knew that this app is run by a Russian company. It means that in a certain way, we have a Russian company that is not clear what kind of entity it is, that is collecting data about facial recognition of Italian citizens.
Right.
It's, states and companies are no longer two different, are no longer in two different categories. They are acting in the same way in this new world.
Right. And Brigadier Malik, we're talking about how citizens and how people of the world are becoming more and more vulnerable to foreign attacks like this. How important is it for governments to step up and make sure that their technological firewalls and protections are robust enough to protect their citizens and their country's safe material?
I think this is perhaps one of the most important threats that population that at large face nowadays. Data harvesting now is becoming almost an organized industry. And not only all businesses, as a matter of fact, are now depending upon data. They first collect data and thereafter then they start marketing their products all over the world. And similarly, when we have large companies in the social media, without naming them, they have millions and millions of clients on their rolls, and they have all their data is available to them. Now, if we go back to what the Russians were accused of during the last American elections, I think that was a classic example of where data was procured, as the Britannica Analytica you spoke of, and how it was used. Now, if you determine that there is a certain area where a lot of conservative people live, then your marketing or your political message to that area or to those class of people would be set accordingly. There's yet to be another area which is where a lot of people with liberal views are living. So you attract them or you talk to them according to their likes and their dislikes. But how do you come across all this data? This exactly is what we are getting through the social media and through all these these multinationals which are controlling all the social media. Now, this information is not only being used politically, it is also being used industrially, commercially, and as we've just heard, that the criminal could also use this data for their own nefarious activities. So we need to definitely have firewalls and checks, which I'm afraid at the global level also we are not having a very great deal of success in this.
Right, and on that point, Mr. Bunker, now this seems like this digital espionage arena seems like it is a lawless place. There are no rules. There are dirty tricks being played. It's a very, very messy picture. Is there an understanding, or is there a move towards at least an understanding that the global community needs to collaborate, find limits, find ways to circumvent it and protect people?
Yeah, look, I think we've seen that very much so when it comes to stopping terrorist events. There's a lot of collaboration between nations' intelligence services and the gathering of intelligence when it comes to stopping terrorist attacks. On the other hand, when we talk about understanding what Brigadier Malik was talking about before, understanding the intent and the capability of your neighbour, there is less rules and there is a lot more obfuscation and there's a lot more underhanded work that goes on to obtain that information.
Right. And Brigadier Malik, do you think that it's given that how important it is to preempt what neighboring countries, enemy countries might have against you, this is absolutely essential, and it's even that's why we're seeing a growth in investment in intelligence agencies, and we're going to just see a more pervasive rise in it.
I think this is a very apt observation, but we also need to see that the nature of warfare has again changed. And the nature of interstate relations has also changed quite a lot. I think the best example would be India and Pakistan. And just look at the way India and Pakistan dealt with one another in the 1960s and in the 1970s, and the way they're dealing with one another nowadays. Nowadays, we are being subjected to enormous pressure through the fifth-generation warfare systems. We have spies here. And these spies are not only carrying out espionage activities, but they're also subverting our country. They are also using terrorism as a tool. And for example, Kulbhushan Yadav would be a very good example to give, where a spy master has combined terrorism or terrorist activities to create a certain situation in Pakistan. Now, this is how the hostile countries try to change the thinking and the thinking of its target country.
And let me ask Mr. Bordonaro this. When we're talking about diplomatic relations and pressurizing other states through diplomatic means, something, of course, coercion is not something that exists in this day and age the same way as it did before. How important is espionage in that regard?
You see, it's again very difficult to have an opinion on that because the question before this one is who is an actor in the international community? And I was thinking when you were talking before about a coalition to face terrorism and cyber attacks. What do you think? It would be better to have in the coalition Belgium or Italy or Google? That's the question that stays at as a base for all our reasonment. We have to understand who is part of the international community, who are the actors and the powerful actors. And it's not just a matter of borders, but it's more about understanding that the world is changing towards a connectography. So the most important lines are those value chains, material or immaterial value chains, more than borders.
Right. And Mr. Bunker, what would your thoughts be to what Bordonaro just stated here?
I actually find them very interesting, and I 100% agree with him, because when you look at it, who has access and who holds more big data? Is it a nation state, or is it someone like Google who is operating cross borders all the time? Yes, it's online, but that is where information is stored these days. It's not stored in safes. It's not stored in filing cabinets. It's stored online. It's stored in the cloud. It's stored in organisations like Google,
right,
like Apple. I really find his take on it and his point very interesting, and I actually agree with it 100%.
Right. And now this talk of regulating these big tech companies, these Silicon Valley companies, the move to limit their powers, is that the step in the right direction? And do you think there will be earnest effort to do that?
Look, I think it's very hard to limit their power. I think one area where it's quite important is during and immediately following a big attack, whether that's a terrorist attack or a hostile event, because terrorist organisations use those platforms created through social media and online platforms to use the event as propaganda to then grow support. So I think it's important that nation states have the ability to impose restrictions on how those types of events are propagated over the internet. But I think we will continually find it harder and harder to really restrict organisations like Facebook, like Google, like Apple, and Android.
Right, and Mr. Bordonaro, coming to the individual, the personal level of it all, how does all of this impact the person, the individual? How much does it impact their lives?
Well, I can say that nowadays, at least in Europe, with the GDPR thing, people are aware that this is a fact. There's someone who's collecting data, and this data can be used. We don't know exactly how. So people are aware, but I think that the behavior is not changing that much. The only thing that we see nowadays as a trend is trying to avoid posting data about children. But in our normal life, we are doing the same way. The reason for this is that we don't understand how the data can be used. It could be very useful to have all your data on an app, But on the same way, if counting step up transmit your data to your insurance can understand if you have a healthy life or not and decide to put a bigger price on you. So we don't know how they are collaborating and how they are sharing data. And this will change, and this will change our behavior in the future.
Right, and the governments reckoning with the realization that citizens are realizing more, not just companies. We have been talking about how powerful and corporate companies, big tech companies have immense power, but also governments do too. They have, surveillance is widespread, but citizens are realizing that more and more. Do you think governments will in the future, or they realize that they need to curb the surveillance in any way to pacify the citizens, or do you think it doesn't matter at all?
Governments do have security and intelligence, but they do it through others' tools. So in a certain way, they are not honing their own security and intelligence. What I foresee is that at a certain point, governments will have to sit with the big companies. We can imagine in the future a G20 where China, Japan, the US sits with Google, Huawei, Facebook.
And on that note, we're going to take a short break. Before we go for break, I'd like to thank Mr. Mathew Bunker for joining us and talking to us. When we return, we're going to discuss this topic further. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We're in conversation with Mr. Valerio Bordonaro and Brigadier Imran Malik, and we're talking about espionage and how it's changing in the modern world. Mr. Bordonaro, now we talked a lot about data and how it's being extracted and how it's being used, but it's also being compromised along with that. Now, a report by Juniper Research showed that 33 billion records will be stolen by cyber criminals in 2023 alone. Now, when all this data is compromised, how much damage does it actually do to countries and to states and nations?
The damage is huge. The potential damage is even worse than that. So maybe, nowadays they're just trying to steal some money, but in the future we can foresee enormous amount of damage. Imagine if at a certain point a criminal group would be able to turn off an electric plant. These are things that can happen. It's enormous.
Right. On that note, we're also joined by Mr. Peter Williams, who's a lecturer in policy at Liverpool John Moores University, an author, and he's also a retired police inspector. He's joining us from Liverpool, UK. Thank you so much, Mr. Williams, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, we've been talking about espionage and how necessary it is, especially when we talk about counting terrorism and also in the changing global dynamics. Give us your take on all of this.
Well, it's completely important because it's what we call these days being intelligence-led. If you take a UK example, our counter-terrorism strategy has 4 elements. One of them is pursue, and the pursue element is what you would actually class as perhaps as being espionage, but it's the way of gathering the information or the intelligence, and intelligence is information that's been evaluated. And that is being used in relation to counter-terrorism. For example, Director General of MI5, the Commissioner of Metropolitan Police, over the last few months, have issued statistics as to how many planned attacks on the UK mainland that the security forces, that's the police and the security services, have been able to prevent because that has been applied. So it's very, very important that we do that. But it's also important that the security services themselves operate within a legal and ethical framework, and also, of course, that what they do, they're also accountable to an extent to a higher authority. So it's absolutely crucial, and of course, all states are engaged in this to a lesser or a greater degree. For example, if we take the Americans, they have a war on terror-led strategy, which is far more proactive than perhaps what we have here in the United Kingdom.
Right. And just a quick take on what your opinion is on the fact that there are these laws, especially in the UK as well, that of course allow for there to be intelligence gathering. The Investigatory Powers Act is one that legalizes taking data and stuff. How does that reconcile with the individual's rights to privacy?
Well, that's an excellent point, and it's something that the security services need to adhere to, because if any intelligence was admitted as evidence, it would need to be admissible evidence for a criminal prosecution.
Could you explain that a little
Kingdom,
to our viewers as
well? Our counterterrorism strategy is what we call it's criminal justice led, i.e. somebody, where there is sufficient evidence to justify a charge and prosecution, somebody would be prosecuted probably in the Old Bailey in London. Now, if that evidence has been gained illegally or gathered illegally or unlawfully, that evidence wouldn't be admitted. So the security services need to be very conscious of that. And, of course, that impinges very much on the issue you've just raised, on that's the rights of the individual. Right.
Brigadier Malik, I also want to touch upon what was mentioned earlier in the show as well, was about how international networks, intelligence networks are existing in order to counter terrorism at a global level. Take us through it. How are these systems working and how are they operating?
See, terrorism now obviously is an international issue now, and it knows no boundaries. And if we talk of terrorist groups like the IS and Al-Qaeda and others of that ilk, we find them operating all over the world. They are operating from Syria down to Afghanistan and now into India as well. So since this is an international issue, it requires an international response as well. And we have certain countries which are, for example, cooperating in this war. Pakistan is cooperating with the United States and its neighbors as well in countering these terrorist groups and terrorism. Now, if we take it a little further, these terrorist groups are now moving into the cyber space as well. And they are using cyberspace to not only increase their recruitment, they are raising funds, and they are propagating their point of view, and they're winning adherence to their cause. And that is how the terrorism and cybercrime are getting together to create yet another extremely serious problem for the world. And I think so far, the counterterrorism cooperation that we are having between states is still not enough. It needs to be much more and much more proactive.
Right. So, Mr. Williams, talking about this, that there needs to be greater collaboration. Now, on one side, there is this fear that every country and every state wants to protect their data and they want to keep it to themselves because of, the corporate interests and all of that. But at the same time, it is also important to share data and to collaborate. Do you think countries are trying to find a balance between it? What lines are there?
Well, I think there is a balance to be established. But what I was about to say is that in relation to sharing of intelligence, or what we now call data, in relation to countries such as the United Kingdom, we've been part of what's called the Five Eyes arrangement with the United States, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, which is a World War II gentleman's agreement. So in that respect, if you take that as a benchmark, we're fairly used to exchanging information, intelligence or data between Pacific countries. It's now, of course, been heightened by, as your previous speaker quite correctly said, is by the use of the cybercrime and the internet. Now, I do think there are some challenges within that, but by and large, there is a successful exchange of information and communication. But what I would say is, focusing on a UK perspective again, in relation to if we left the European Union, for example, we would potentially lose access to a lot of data because of the legal requirements of the European Union, which the United Kingdom would no longer be a member of. So there are a lot of issues in relation to that question which you've just raised.
Right. And those are very important points you've highlighted here. And unfortunately, we don't have time to go over all of them. But Mr. Bordonaro, on a parting note and asking you a last question regarding all of this, we covered a lot of the material here, but we didn't really talk about the risks involved when you go forward in espionage and intelligence gathering, and especially state-sponsored agents. Just take us through that.
Well, it's easy. We are now exploring a subject that is totally unknown. We know that espionage and gathering intelligence is an ancient practice of the human being, but it's changing so quickly that we cannot understand what are the tools and which are the actors. Citizens are a little bit aware of it, but not totally. The states are trying to cope with it. European Union is a good example. But still, there's a lot of work to do, and the corporations will be of big help for all the nation states. And we'll see what's going to happen in the future. But crime, of course, is there. Where there's space, there's going to be a crime.
Right. And on that note, thank you so much, Mr. Valerio Bordonaro, for joining us and talking to us. Thank you, Mr. Peter Williams from Liverpool, UK. And thank you so much, Mr. Brigadier Imran Malik, for joining us here in the studios. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.